Kavod Harav, how are you?
Shem, thank you.
Oh.
Okay, so let's get started. So yesterday we did Bet. Now we're going to do Gimel, third halacha. So it says here in the tour, כתב רבנו פרץ, right? It says in רבנו פרץ, יש נוהגים לברר החיטין אחד מאכילת עכבר. So he says, right, there's a custom by some that, when they use the wheat to grind, to make the matzot, what they do is they go through it, they check it first. So they check the wheat. So what are they checking for? So he says, right, we don't want to use wheat which was eaten by a mouse, right? Whatever. Um, some say you don't need to do that. They have a meperot. So he says, why? Why don't you need to do that? Because it's like considered to be like fruit juice. So what does that mean? Right? I have to explain that to you. That the problem is, when the mouse eats it, so it gets, it's kind of disgusting, but the saliva of the mouse gets on it, right? So it could become chametz because it got wet. So the other opinion says, you don't have to worry about that. Why? Because, the saliva is not like water. It's not the same thing. It's more like fruit juice. And fruit juice doesn't leaven. So therefore, right, you don't need it. So he writes, this rabbi, that it's not like fruit juice. Sharok machamitz. Why? Because he says, right, that the saliva does actually leaven the wheat. Right, so that's what it says, right? That in the Mishnah, that a person shouldn't chew the wheat and put it on his wound, right? Whatever. If he has some kind of a wound. What's the reason why? Because once he chews it, right, it'll become chametz from his saliva. Okay, so let's go on.
Why doesn't that work for people if it works for mice?
That's the thing, right? He's trying to say that you see from there that also the mouse is the same thing. He's trying to prove it from there, right? That you have to be careful about that.
He disagrees with the mouse thing.
No, no. Let's recap it again, right? We have here two opinions. One says you got to be careful with the mouse, right? The other one says no, it's like fruit juice, right? So comes the one, who was stringent and says, but you see from the Talmud that it's not like fruit juice. Why? Because you see that, right? You shouldn't chew the wheat.
I got it. Thanks.
So that's like the first opinion, which is stringent. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. So he's bringing a source from the Talmud, to prove that. So okay, so he says, "Ve'itanan al makatom." Then lakil. So he says, therefore, says this rabbi, right? You shouldn't be lenient regarding that. So what does that mean, right? According to this, what you should do is, right, before you start, making flour to make matzot, and you're grinding up the wheat, you should check the wheat very carefully, to make sure there's no bite marks there from those nasty, right, mice. Right, you got to check that out. You got to make sure that it's all clean. That's the idea. Nowadays, by the way, like the average, people, most people, we just go to the store and we buy, the flour, right? We don't make the flour, we don't grind the wheat at home. We don't do that. So, I mean, it's already been done for you, basically, right? So what you do is, you buy something with hechsher, and make sure that it's got a hechsher and it's been done properly, and this way, right, you're covered. That's the way to do it. By the way, there's also a similar problem in our times, that we have also, which resembles this problem, probably even worse, than this problem, which is that they say, that when you buy flour, like let's say, you just go to the store, right? And you buy, like Pillsbury flour, and you use it to make matzot. Can you do that? Right? That's the question, right? I'm not talking about for the night of the Seder, because for that you need Shmura Matzah, right? We're going to talk about that later on, but for the rest of the days of Passover, you don't need Shmura Matzah. You can just use regular matzot, you know what I mean? Which is not Shmura. So then why can't you just go and buy, some flour in the store, and make matzot? Why not? Just, go buy some regular flour, right? Like everybody else. Pillsbury, right? So the answer to that question is that we can't do that in our times. Why is that? Because what they do, in the factory, when they produce the flour, you know what they do? They have a machine, right, that washes the wheat with water. So guess what, right? Once you wash the wheat with water, it's already chametz, in about 20 minutes, right? So that's it. You're done, right? Your goose is cooked, as they say, right? So, right, this is the reason why we can't use flour like that. Just go to the store and buy, flour off the shelf to make matzot. So what you got to do is, you got to buy kosher matzah flour, right, which is especially made for Passover, right? And if you're using it to make the matzot for the seder, it also has to be shmura, it has to be guarded from the time of the reaping, which is very, it's already much more expensive and it's much more right, it's much more difficult to accomplish that. So that problem resembles this problem. It's probably even worse, right? Okay, so we'll talk about that in the future also, Bezat Hashem, regarding the type of flour you can use and all kinds of things, right? Things like this. Okay, so let's go on. So he says, "ונראה שאין לחוש לזה כלל, דחשש הרחוקה היא." So says the Tur himself, he says he doesn't agree with this. So meaning what? He says, right, it's like it's too much, it's too stringent, the Tur says, right? זו, לומר שהחמיץ חיטה קשה במעט רוק שבפי העכבר. So he says, right, it's a little far-fetched to say, he says, right, that the wheat became leavened by that little, amount of saliva which is in the mouth of the, right, that stinky, right, whatever, right, mouse, right, that dirty mouse, whatever, right, he says it's far-fetched to, he says also that the wheat is hard, so it's hard, far-fetched to say such a thing like that, אפילו לתיתה שרה בגמרא. So he says, because, in the Talmud, even allows to do letita, right? We'll see what that means. אלא שהחמירו הגאונים לאוסרה. So he says, regarding letita, right? Which is like, I think, soaking or something like that. We'll see what that is exactly. I'm not sure. But he says, right, that the Geonim forbade that after the Talmud, But in the Talmud, it allows to do that. The Geonim came later, right? The Geonim were after the Talmud, right? So they came and they forbade. ועוד אפילו אם יש בהם נישוחין, אינו אחד מאלף מתבטלין כשיטתן. So he says, not only that, right, but even if you do have, some wheat which was bitten by the mouse, right, the mice, whatever, right, so he says it's nullified anyway, right, it's like 1 out of 1,000, so it gets nullified, so what do I care, right, 1 out of 1,000 certainly does get nullified. Okay, that's what he's saying. Yeah. So he says, it's not called that you're nullifying the prohibition, right? In the preferred manner, right? Whatever. In other words, to do it in a to do it in a lechatchila, which means that you prefer to do it that way. Sheno tochen kedei lebatla. So he says because you're not grinding it, in order to nullify, right? You're just grinding it to use it as flour. Okay, so there you go, right? So that's the tour. So tour doesn't right. He's not interested in this stringency, right? He's not into it. Okay, so let's see what the Bet Yosef says. So says Bet Yosef, right? He brings a source for this and other sources, right? King Katua got Maimon. That's what it says also there. Per K, right? Which is one of the commentaries on the Rambam. B'Shem Samak, right? Name of the Samak. V'zeh Leshono, he says over there like this. U'B'Arbe Mekomot, he says there are many places. Nuhagim livror achitin bepesach, that they sift out, right? The wheat on Passover, right? For Passover. Mechilat achbar. So what are they doing? They're looking, right, for those kernels that were bit by the mice. Ah. So he says, but there are some who want to, right, permit this, they don't care about it. As we saw in the tour, right? Mishum dehave ke Some say, right, it's like as we said, right? The saliva is like fruit juice. Umiu kasher, but he says that's really difficult, as we already said, right? We already pushed that out. That's not correct. Because we learned in the Mishnah, loyal os adam chitim, right? We already said, right, that the saliva is a problem according to the Talmud, right? We mentioned that. So he brings the same thing here as well, right? So you got to be careful. So what does that mean? According to the Talmud, as we said, right, saliva can leaven the wheat, right? Very simple. ויתן על גבי מכתו, right? מפני שמחמיצים. עלמא לכלוח הפה לא חשיב כמי פירות. So he says, you see from there, right, that the saliva is not considered to be fruit juice. Okay, right? Mistama hu adin achilat achbar. So he says, we have no reason to assume, right, that the mouse is any different than a human, right? It's all the same. As you said, right? It's all the same. What difference does it make if it's a mouse or a human, right? You know that there's this right there's this scientific thing now, that they say that the DNA of the mouse, right, it resembles the human more than anything else, right? So, in terms of DNA, we're very close to the mice. So, that shows you, right, that our saliva probably isn't much different than theirs. It's pretty funny, pretty sad. What can I tell you? But I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. I'm not really sure. But right, that's the way it is. So yeah. By the way, I did check that on Google yesterday. This is what we discussed regarding the oat matzot. So it does say on Google, that somebody who has gluten intolerance can have oats, right? But it says it has to be, like pure, like without any additives. You know what I mean? If it's like pure oats with no additives, so then you can have even somebody who has a gluten intolerance can have it. So that means, right, that's the solution for the gluten people, right? That if they want to have matzot on Passover, which I'm sure they want to, right? They want to do the mitzvah, so they have to have oat matzah, right? That's their solution. But it has to be pure oats, right? No additives, right? Whatever. Otherwise, there could be some gluten mixed in there, from other things. That's what it says on Google. Okay. If you believe in Google, right? I hope you believe in Google, whatever, right? Okay, so if you don't, what can I tell you, right? You have to find a different source. Okay, so right, as we said, getting back to what we said. So he says, "Ve'en lechalek leakel belo raya." So he says, right, therefore you can't just make a differentiation, without any proof to say, oh, gee whiz, like humans and mice are different. How do you know they're different? You have any proof for that? Right? Like what makes you think they're different? בלא היה, ועוד דהד לאחר כך, right, משמערבין בו מים, אז אכילת העכבר מחמיץ. So he says also another thing, he says that when you add water to it, right, eventually, when you're going to make your dough, right, then he says when you add the water to the saliva, it makes it leaven. The piresh leel, like we explained above, the meperot כשמערבין בו מים מחמיצין. So that's the thing, right, that even if you say, he says, right, that saliva is like fruit juice, it could still be a problem anyway. Why is that? Because it says in the Talmud that right, if you make matzot from fruit juice, right, which is something, by the way, to the Sephardim they do that. So what's the advantage to that? When you make it from fruit juice, it doesn't leaven, right? It never leavens. You can leave it there for 2 hours; it won't leaven. Uh, but you can't do the mitzvah, right, with this kind of matzah. For the Seder night, it has to be made with water. But you can have it for Passover, as a nice snack, whatever, right? No problem. You can do that. The Ashkenazim, by the way, don't eat that, right? They don't eat this kind of matzah. So we'll now make you understand why they don't eat it, right? There's a custom by them not to eat that. So the reason is because the Talmud says, right, that even though fruit juice never leavens the dough, right, but that's only if you don't add any water, But if you add water also, then it does leaven the dough, Even the fruit juice leavens it, and it's even faster, by the way. So therefore, this is why the Ashkenazim don't use it, right? We call that matzah shira, right? Egg matzah they call it, right? The Ashkenazim called egg matzah. It's not only made from eggs; you can also make it from fruit juice, right, or whatever, all kinds of things. You can make it from wine, right? All kinds of things like that. But if it has added water, then you got a big problem, right? That's the thing. That's why the Ashkenazim don't eat it, and that's why, right? In this case, he says, right, that here, what happens is that even if you tell me that the fruit juice, right? I'm sorry, even if you tell me the saliva is like fruit juice, but once you add water, boy, you're in trouble, right? That's the thing, you have to add water eventually, right? What are you gonna do, right? What else? How else are you gonna make matzot if you don't add water? So therefore, right, it's gonna be even worse. It's gonna be even faster. It's gonna leaven even faster. Machmitzin, all right, but Rambam. So it says from the Ramban, the Tshuva of the Ramban, Besiman Kufnun, right, in this chapter, Kedivya Rabbeinu. So it's like the Tur. So meaning what? The Rabbeinu, the Tur, he was lenient regarding this, right, as we said. So the Ramban also seems to be lenient regarding this, right? He's not concerned about those naughty, right, nasty mice, right, wandering around in your wheat, right? He doesn't care about it. Okay. So it goes on here, right? Vehi b'tshuvat Rashba. So it's brought down in the tshuva of the Rashba, right? The opinion of the Ramban. Katvu Gaot Maimoniot b'Perek Aleph. This rabbi writes, B'Shem Samak, in the name of this rabbi, right? That what? Al Lagran shetzamach milachluchit haaretz shekorin garmi. Oh, so he says, right, that I don't know exactly what this is, but I've never really come across it. But he says there's a type of grain, right, that sprouts from the moisture of the land, right? In other words, from moisture, right? And it's called girmi, whatever, right? Girmi. Omer Rabbeinu Yechiel. So the question is, right, since it's sprouting out of like water, basically, right? Moisture. So the question is it already chametz, as it is, whatever, something like that, right? So says Rabbeinu Yechiel, shezeu chimutz gamur. So he said that's like total chametz, right? You can't use that because it's sprouting in water, right? Something like that, right? Like hydroponics, whatever they call it, right? Whatever you call that stuff. Gamur. So he says when you mix it with other grains, right? You have to sift it out. You got to make sure you get that stuff out of there, right? So this is like some kind of right? Again, a grain which grows in water, right? Moisture. Interesting. Right? So you have to have 60th, right? It has to be nullified in 60th if grains that did not, right? They didn't sprout in water. And he says, even though it's dry, but he says it gives taste when you bake it. So therefore, it doesn't get nullified a majority. So it says also you have to bake it before Passover. Okay. Why is that? Why do you have to bake it before Passover? Because, right, then it gets nullified in 60th at least, right? Because the truth is, right, anything you bake on Passover itself, it does not get nullified. There's a rule like this. The rabbis made a stringency, right? That whatever you bake on Passover itself does not get nullified. But if you baked it before Passover, right, it does get nullified. That's the thing. So that's why he says you should do it like that. Okay. So good. דיבר פסח אפילו כלשהו אסור. על כן, he says, therefore, נכון הוא להיזהר שלא יהיה כלל מאותו גרמי. So he says, therefore, right, you should be careful. Make sure you don't have any of that, right, those grains like that, that sprout from moisture. Whatever that is, right? There must be an English name for this. I don't know. I don't know what it is, but I guess we need Google for that too, right? Whatever. So anyway, Bitfua. Ki le'olam hu sham. So it says because it's always there. In other words, you always have something in there like that, in every batch. So he says, make sure you get it out, Mitareb bitfua. So it gets mixed up with the grains. V'regilut hu le'afot matzot bepesach. It says, and he says that then you bake matzot right with it. So in other words, since we do bake matzot right with things like this, so he says try to do it before Passover, right? This way, it won't be a problem because it'll get nullified. But if you bake it on Passover, right, and there's that stuff there, that right, that those wet grains, right, whatever they call that, right, then it's not going to get nullified. Okay, good. By the way, there's an old custom, according to the Kabbalah, that like the pious people, in Jerusalem in the old days, also especially, right, even nowadays they do it. There's like a great mitzvah, whatever, like according to Kabbalah, that those matzot that you're using for the seder, for the night of the seder, you should make them erev Pesach, like in the afternoon, before Passover. It's considered to be like a big thing. So what they do is, they line up at the bakery, right? They come with their flour, and they bake their, matzot, 3 matzot, to use for the seder that night. So right. So why am I telling you this? Is because even that, right? You're doing Erev Pesach, it's before Passover, so it still gets nullified, because you're baking in the afternoon. The afternoon still gets nullified. So you're okay. Even if you have those wet matzot in there, right? Those wet grains, you're still okay according to that. Okay, interesting. So we'll see the Shulchan Aruch here. Shulchan Aruch Gimel. It says here, Ve'im lo biruru achitim machilat achbar. So he says, right, that if they didn't, right, sift out the wheat, right, to make sure to get rid of those, right, those mousy ones, right, the ones that the mouse chewed them, and bechaklum. So he says, Shulchan Aruch, we don't care about that. There you go, right. So he's also lenient, right, like the tour, right, like the tour was lenient, and also the Ramban, as we said, was lenient. So the Maran here also, the Shulchan Aruch is lenient regarding that. As we said, right, there's good reasons to be lenient, as we said, because it gets nullified, and and there's not really that much saliva. How much saliva can a mouse have, right? For God's sakes, you know what I mean? Right. So it's not really so significant, the whole thing, right? So therefore, right, says the Shulchan Aruch that it's allowed. Yeah, nothing there, no problem with that. So says the Rama, so the Rama says another thing, right? What about if they didn't sift out that flour, right? As we said, not the flour, right? The wheat that sprouted, right? So it's right, same thing also applies, right? Those things that as we said, right? We mentioned about Yosef. But I think the Ramah here is talking about something else. Let me just 1 second. Yeah, so the Ramah here seems to be saying something else, not what we saw in the Bet Yosef. He's bringing here this from the right Hagot Maimoniot. Interesting. Okay, let me see the Mishnah Berurah. I'm just not sure if he's talking here about what we said in the Bet Yosef or not. Oh, seems like it's missing some words here. Right, yeah, so the Mishnah Berurah says, right, he explains it, that it's talking about what we saw in the Bet Yosef. So according to that, right, let's explain it. So says the Ramah, right, as we saw in the Bet Yosef already, if you didn't sift out, right, also that wheat that sprouts, from moisture, it's still kosher, right? Why is that? Because it gets nullified, as we said, right? It gets nullified in a 60th. So says the Ramah, right? You got to be careful that you have enough to nullify it. You know what I mean? In other words, there you have 60th, right, which can nullify that moisture grain, right? Whatever you want to call it. So what does that mean? The Ramah is telling you, right, that you should be careful. Make sure that you don't have too much of that stuff in there, because if you do, right, it won't get nullified, right? Because you need 60th. Okay, interesting. So, all right, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll go on. Okay, interesting. So it says here in the yeah, we'll read the tour first. Let's start with the tour. So it says in the tour, right? Katav Arif, right? The Rif writes, Katav Rav Alfas, right? Rav Alfas is the Rif. שצריך לשמור חיטים שיוצאים בה ידי מצה משעת קצירה, שלא יבוא עליהם מים. Oh, so says the Rif, right? That those wheat, that you're going to use to make matzot, right? And you're going to do the mitzvah of matzah, right? What does that mean? You're going to use it for the seder, right? The seder night. The mitzvah of matzah. You're going to use it for that. So then he says you got to be careful that they shouldn't. You got to guard them from the time of the reaping, right? Once you reap them from the ground, you got to make sure they don't get wet. Because if they do, right, they can become chametz easily. So, right, just to let you know, by the way, that this only applies once you reap it. But if it's still attached to the ground, it doesn't leaven, right? In other words, you could get like rain on it, right, all the time. It's raining on it, right, day and night, raining, pouring, right? It's not going to make it chametz. It only becomes chametz once you reap it. But before the reaping, when it's attached to the ground, it does not become chametz with water. So you could put all the water in the world on it, right? Nothing will happen. So therefore, right, the rule is you got to start watching it when? From the time of the reaping, right? Once you reap it, you got to watch it. You got to guard it, right? It's called matzah shmura, right? Guarded matzah. Okay, so that's the Rif, right? That's what the Rif says. But the Rosh says, no, you don't need to be so stringent, right? He says, you only have to guard it from the time that you grind it, right? From the grinding. Interesting. This is brought down, by the way, in the Shulchan Aruch, these opinions. We're going to see. So he says, right, this is the language of the Rosh. Noagin be'Ashkenaz, so he says in Germany, the custom is, with Tzarfat, also in France, he says, right? Germany and France, the custom is the Shomran Mishat Techina. We guard it from the time of the grinding, right? Not from the time of the reaping. Okay. So so it says, you know why? Why do you have to guard it from the time of the grinding? He says, because that's the time where it starts to get in contact with the water. That's when the water starts getting on it. Why is that? So he says, because you know what they do? They grind it in a water mill, right? In a mill from water mill. So the water mill has lots of water, obviously, right? There's lots of water there. It's like a river, whatever, something like that, right? So therefore, since there's a lot of water, there is concern, right, that the water will get on the wheat. So therefore, according to the Rosh, you have to guard it from the time of the grinding and not from the time of the reaping. By the way, nowadays, we're stringent about this, like, that we guard it from the time of the reaping. But we're going to talk about this, right? There's a little bit more details that have to be said about that, depending on, what you're using the matzah for, what the purpose is, so forth and so on. And also, it depends on availability, like whatever you can find, whatever, right? If you can't find this, you can use that. Whatever. So we'll see that. We'll talk about that. So it says, Kakata b'sheltot. That's what it says also in sheltot. La nafik yedeh chobate ela b'matzad mintera michimutz min kad nafal maya ilaves. Right? So the sheltot says like this, right? That you got to guard the matzot. You got to guard the wheat from the time that the water gets on it, right? From that time, it has to be guarded. So what does that mean? It comes into proximity with water, Once that happens, you got to guard it. Okay. והמתינו לחיטי עקום, right? חרש יוצא וקטן, לא נפיק בידי חובת... Okay, I think that's already something else there. So let's look at the Bet Yosef here. So it says Bet Yosef, right? He brings here the riff, as we said, from the Torah, right? All that. So where is this riff, right? We just mentioned. The Bet Yosef says, בסוף פרק כל שעה, right? So over there in his Gemara, י' בית עמוד א', כתב, ומבאי לאינשל לינטורי קמחא דפיסחא, מעידן דקצירה. So it says the riff, right, in Aramaic, right, that you gotta guard the wheat from the time of the reaping. The Amakra, because the verse says, right, the pasuk says, Shemot Yud Bet, right, ushmartem et hamatzot. It says, right, you should guard the matzot. It says, guard them, right. So you gotta guard the matzot. ואמר להו רבה, להן הוא דמהפכה כפה, כי מפחיתו, הפיכו לשם מצה. כלומר, היזהרו שלא יבוא עליהם מים פירושי כפה, אמרים, וכן כתב רמב"ם פרקי, right, so this rabbi says, right, that you got to guard it from the time that it gets, water on it. So he says, the Rambam also says like this, right, פרקי, בסוגיה דשמטין בסוף פרק כל שעה אחייתה. So he says also in the Gemara, in Mem Amud Aleph, that's the way it comes out. Amar Rabba, mitzvah liltot shenemar, ushmartem et hamatzot, אלו דבעי לתיתה, שימור למאי, שימור לדלישה, שימור דלישה, לאו שימור הוא. דאמר רב הונא, בצקות של גויים, אדם ממלא קרסו מהם, בלבד שיאכל כזית מצה באחרונה. Okay, so let me just go back and read this, right, one more time. I read it very fast, I'm sorry. Just wanted to get the general idea of what's going on here. So we'll reread this one more time. So it says, right, as we said, first of all, as we said, right, the riff says you got to guard it from the time of the reaping. And he brings the verse, right, you got to guard the matzot, it says. So he tells them, right, that when you process the wheat, whatever, right, you got to do it for the sake of the matzah. So it has to be done also with intention, right, for the sake of the matzot. Right? So, but he says, right, he doesn't explain it like that. What he says is like this, the Bet Yosef. He says that it means that you got to make sure that no water gets on it, right? So in other words, the whole point is like this, that, once the water gets on it, it's going to become chametz. So therefore, you got to guard it and make sure it never gets wet. That's the bottom line, right? That's exactly what we said, right? This is the reason why it's a problem to buy, your Pillsbury dough, right? Your Pillsbury flour, because they wash it with they wash the wheat with water, in order for cleanliness. Today the hygiene is a very big thing, right? In the plants. So that's why, they wash everything. That's the way it goes. So once they wash it, right, it's done, right? You can't use that anymore. That's it, you're finished, right? You're eating chametz on Passover, right? If you eat that stuff. Okay, so let's go on. So you have to make sure, right, that you use flour, which was never washed. The wheat was never washed. Because if it was, right, there's nothing to talk about. Okay, so let's go on. So the Chen Katav Rambam, right? Says the Rambam also like that, same thing, right? So meaning what? He seems to agree with the Rif. So in other words, these Rishonim hold that you need to, guard the matzot from the time of the reaping. Because, as we said, right, you got to make sure it doesn't get wet. Vesugya deshmatin besof per kol sha'a. So he says, right, there's also another Gemara, as we said. Hachi ta'amar Rabba mitzvah litot shenamar, right? So Rabba says over there, it's a mitzvah to do letita, right? So we'll see what that means, right? Shenamar ushmatem at matzot. It says, well, you got to guard the matzot. Ilo de ba'e letita shimur lemai shimur ledelisha, shimur delisha lav shimuhu. So he says, right, you got to guard it when you do the letita to make sure that it doesn't get wet. So, so he says, right, that here's the thing, right? It says in the Talmud like something, something pretty impressive. It says in the Talmud that you're allowed to take, a dough, right, which was, from the non-Jews, right, and eat it on Passover. So meaning what? That we have no problem with that. So it implies, by the way, from this context over here, that the word letita, right, which I wasn't sure what it meant, it implies that it means that what you're doing is, you're coating it with water on the outside, like on the outside, just like basting it with water. But I'll make sure about that, right? I don't want to tell you something which is not precise. So we'll make sure. I'm just telling you, right? That's the way it implies here from this language, but we'll see, right? So in other words, you got to be careful when you do that it doesn't get wet, whatever. But I don't know. It still needs some more clarification. Right, we'll have to clarify that a little bit more. So it says, right, that the lisha lav shimuhu the amar rab huna b'ksakot shel goyim adam mimelek rasam en bilvad shochak gazak matzah. But it says, right, you can even use right the dough which is from the goyim. It says, right, as long as you eat a kazait afterwards. Why is that? Because you have to do right one kazait of the mitzvah that it has to be from guarded from the time of the reaping, as we said, right, to do the mitzvah. That's something else. But in general, right, to eat it, just to eat it for eating. Right, so then you can even use dough, which is from the goyim. So we have to understand how that works, right? How does that function? Well, we'll get into it more, right? We're just getting started over here, right? So don't worry. We're not at the end game yet. Okay, so it says, right, משום דלא עבד בהוא שימור ולעביד לשימור מאפייה אלא עליו שמע מן השימור מעיקר המעינן. So it says, right, that but why don't we just do right the guarding from the time of the baking? So he says, you see from there that we need to guard it from beginning, right? So what does that mean, beginning? From the reaping. וממאי דילמה שינה איתם דבעידנא דנחי דשימור לא עבד לה שימור, אבל היכא דבעידנא דנחי דשימור עבד לה שימור, הכי נמי דשימור דלישה הווה שימור, ואפילו הכי לא הדרבה רבה. So he says, right, that there's a whole discussion over here, right? Discourse about this, how this works, But in the end, right, the Gemara says that Rabbi did not retract on his opinion here. Damar lehanhu de mehapche kefe more bered ravina minaktele amite berave. Rashi. So now Rashi explains, right, all this stuff, right? So we need some explanation here. It's not so clear, right? This language that we just read. So Rashi explains, right? Shimur delisha lav shimurhu. He says, right, that guarding it, when it comes to right lisha is not called shimur. It's not called guarding. If you don't do it before that, right, it's not enough to guard it just from there. So meaning what? To guard it from the time of the kneading is not enough, right? That's not enough. You have to guard it before that, right? מאפיה ואילך, משתקמא אביה כגון עריכתה ככתוב. So he says, right, that why don't you guard it from the time that you make it into a dough? שלא ניתנו לתנור, they didn't put it in the oven yet. וממאי דילמה לעולם שימור דלישה שימור. Maybe, right, guarding it from the time of the kneading is called guarding. ואף אגב, דלא הצריך שימור או מקמא הכי, even though it doesn't need to be guarded before that. ואחר מאי תמה לא נפיק משום דמשת נתינת מים לקמח, הווה צריכה שימור. So he says, then why doesn't you fulfill the obligation with this? Because at the time of the putting of the water on the right with the flour, right? Habiat sicha shimur. It already needs guarding. V'zu lo nasela, and they didn't do that. The shimur me'aidi from that time. It's guarded from that time. The nachit letorat shimur de'ainu demetinat mayim, from the time of putting the water. V'afilu hachi says, nevertheless, the lo ashkach rava siyata lemilte lo hadabe. Even though the Rava didn't find any support for his words, nevertheless he didn't retract, right? So therefore, right, the Rava still sticks with his guns and says that you need to guard it before the kneading, right? The time of the kneading is too late already, right? You have to guard also before that. So in other words, here, right, what he's saying is that you need to guard it from the type of the reaping. ולכאורה נראה שדעת הריפי הרמב"ם דליקובה באי רבה שימור משעת הקצירה. So right now, says the Bet Yosef, right? What do you see from all this discussion? That according to the Rif and the Rambam, right, this is something crucial, that you have to guard it from the time of the reaping. So meaning what? Guarding it from the time of the kneading, when you actually add the water, right, is not enough, according to this opinion, right? So therefore, you have to guard it from the time of the reaping. And if you did not, according to the Rif and the Rambam, it's not kosher, this matzah, right, for the mitzvah. It's not kosher. You can't do the mitzvah with it. Right, but it says, and we pass like that, right? Says the Bet Yosef, Sharan katav al divrei Arif, because the Ran writes regarding the words of the Rif. So he says, right, that that's the best way to do it, like the Rif says, right, to guard it from the time of reaping. But he says it's possible that even if he didn't do so, he didn't guard it from the time of the reaping. Right? They just bought, he went to the market, right? As we said, right, and he bought some flour, and he guarded it for matzah. Right? You fulfill obligation. So as we said, right, today you can't do this because they washed the wheat. You know what I mean? But in the old days, when they were not washing the wheat, you could just go to the store, and buy your Pillsbury dough, not the dough, right, but your flour, right, and use that to make matzot. If you had no choice, right, you could do that. Why is that? Because it never got any water on it, as far as we know, right? We don't assume that they got wet. So therefore, in the old days, it was kosher to do that. Nowadays, as we said, right, it's a problem because they wash it. Okay, so and we say right in the Talmud that just guarding it from the time of the kneading is not enough, right? It has to do it before. So it has to be guarded before the kneading. But he says if you did guard it before the kneading, right? Not from the time of the reaping, but from the time before the kneading, right? It's kosher. But he says, right, implies that if he guarded it from the time of the kneading and onward, you can't do the mitzvah matzah from there. You can't fulfill your obligation. But he says there's one big rabbi who said, right, that you can go and buy, right, as we said, flour from the market. Right? If you have no choice, right, you're hard pressed, mutar delo machasikinan isura, because he says we don't assume that it got wet. We have no reason to assume that, right? As we said today, it's a little different, but in those days there was no reason to assume that it got wet, and we don't presume, right, that it got wet, because there's a rule like this in halacha, in kashrut, that we don't assume something came and made your food not kosher if we don't see that, right? If we didn't see it, we don't assume that something came there. So therefore there's no reason to assume that that flour got wet, right? There's no reason for that. So therefore, he can fulfill his obligation. But he says lechatchila though, right? The preferred way is what? By shimur, right? It has to be guarded. Mashma, right? The shimur delisha lo have shimur. So you see from there he holds, right, that guarding it from the time of the kneading is not enough. I know lechatchila, that's lechatchila only, right? According to the Ran. Okay, interesting. So let's see how much more we got here. Let's just check. Okay, would you like to finish this? Like, we need like 5 more minutes. Is it okay with you?
Yes.
Okay, so we need a little bit more time. Okay, so a little patience, if you don't mind, and we'll try to finish it off. So then he brings the Rosh over here, right? Ve'arosh katav ve'zeh leshano, right? Says the Rosh regarding this. Ve'afilu hachi lo hadar be'Rava. Says, but Rava did not retract from what he held. That you needed to have right from before the kneading. De'amar lehu Rava le'anhu de'me'afche kefe. Klomar afilu shenidchu divrei Rava. Says even though the words of Rava were refuted right in the Talmud, but he didn't retract. Because he holds right that from the time of the kneading it's already too late to guard it. Right? He didn't retract anyway, right? The Rava, and therefore, right, he holds that you have to do it from the time of the reaping. So he says he was stringent on himself, Rava, right? In other words, not in halacha. He was stringent on himself as a personal, stringency. Right? Mishat Kisira, from the time of the reaping. Lishmor matzah shel mitzvah, right? To guard the matzah mitzvah. Right? So it also implies that it's really a stringency. The Kamar, more bread than Ravina, right? Since this rabbi said, so it implies from the Talmud, he says, right, that this person was stringent on himself, right? But not really, the halacha is not like that. So it says the other rabbis were not stringent like him, so therefore it was a personal stringency that this rabbi had. Right? Also, Rav Huna, what he said, right, that you're allowed to take dough which comes from the non-Jews, right, and use that. So you see from there, right, that the halacha is not like Rava. So he says, right, that but you have to eat a kazait afterwards, as we said, right, for the mitzvah. Because you didn't do guarding, right, from the time of lisha, from the time of eating. So it implies that if he took flour from the goy, right, you went to the market, right, as we said, you went to Trader Joe's, right, so you went over there, right, then you bought right, the flour, and he kneaded it, so it's kosher, right, as we said, in those days it was kosher, right, and so then you wouldn't have to eat another kazait of matzah in the end. So he says, right, the custom in Germany and France was to guard it from the time of the grinding, right? As we already saw, right? That's the opinion of the Rosh, as we saw in the tour already, right? Because that's when they put it into proximity with water, right? That's the thing. As we said, right? Because they use a mill, which is a water mill. So he says, what about the sheltot? The Rosh brings it down. Shamu mashma de Rabbeinu, it implies to Rabbeinu, the tour, the midi katav be'atminhu amtinu lechite goy sherosh katan de beolacha letchon ma'ire ve'im ken mash katav matzah de mitra michimutz min kad nafal maya ilave haynu lomar shemishar shehu karov lepol alav ma'im dehaynu mishat techina. So he says, right, that he's also the way you got to learn a shel tot is also that he's talking about you got to guard it from the time of the grinding, he says. Ve'lachu debaya shimur, from then and on you need to guard it, but not before that, right? Not from the time of the reaping. But says Rabbi Yerucham writes Katab B'Shem Shel Tot. He writes the name of the Shel Tot. Sheni Yotzei Dei Chobat Matzah. Right, you can't fulfill your obligation with matzah like that. Ela sheshamra mechimutz. You have to guard it from from leavening. Mitchat shenafla alav mayim, from the time that the water fell on it. Mitzira, from the time of the reaping. So he says, right, that this whole thing about guarding the matzot, right, is only talking about for the mitzvah, right, for the seder, that's it, right? That's what we need to be guarded. Right, the mitzvah. But he says the rest of the matzot that you eat on Passover, right, your garden variety matzah, right? Your box matzah, right? Your machine matzah, whatever it is, right? That stuff, lo by shimush mitzvah. It doesn't have to be guarded for the sake of the mitzvah. It doesn't need that. There's no mitzvah to guard it like that. Klal. V'chen mashma me'ahud the tzekot shel goim, right? That's how some buy in Talmud that we said you can buy the dough right from the non-Jews. Shkatav Rabbeinu v'siman she'achar zeh v'chen katvu Aran. The two writes it in the next chapter, and also the Ran. Magid, also this rabbi, Zal, Rabbeinu. So that's also the right the implication of the tour. That writes the name of the Rif. So what does the Rif say? Right, the Rif says you have to guard only the matzot that you're doing for the mitzvah, but the other matzot that you eat on Passover don't need to be guarded like that. So what does that mean? We assume, right, that it's okay. We have no reason to assume that it got wet. So therefore, right, we can rely on that. Okay, good. So let's just do the Shulchan Aruch and we're done. Very nice. Long discussion. So it says over here in the Shulchan Aruch, right, the Daled, החיטים שעושים בהם מצות, right, מצת מצווה, טוב לשמן, שלא יפלו עליהם משעת קצירה, right? So he says, right, the proper thing to do is like this, right? The preferred way is that when you're making matzot for the mitzvah of the seder, right? Good idea to guard them from the time of the reaping, which is, according to the Rif and the Rambam, right? That's what they hold. Right? And then at the time of the grinding, right, you do the, I'm sorry, I didn't say it right. But at least, right, if you can't do that, so the next best thing is what? Guard it from the time of the grinding, right, as we said, because the Rosh holds like that. So we say, right, the preferred way is to do like the Rif and the Rambam, to guard it from the time of the reaping. But if you can't find stuff like that, right, so at least, guard it from the time of the, right, of the grinding. What does that mean when you grind the wheat right into the flour? At least that much. But it says right when it's when you have a right difficult situation. In other words, you can't find good shmura matzah right flour so you can just go to the store right and buy just regular flour Pillsbury right as we said but as we said right today it's a problem because they wash it so. Things are a little bit different today. So therefore, right, don't go buy Pillsbury for Passover, right? This year or whatever, or next year, or whatever, any year. Right? So until Mashiach comes in, maybe then we'll talk about it, right? So right so therefore, if you want to make right anything with the flour on Passover or before Passover for Passover, right? You have to get special flour which is kosher for Passover, right? That's the only way to do it. Because then you know that it was guarded, right? At least from the time of the grinding, or preferably, right, even from the time of the reaping. Okay, any questions before we head off? Okay, so I hope I didn't confuse you too much, right? I think I confused myself a little bit. But anyway, right, we'll see you tomorrow. Hashem, Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov. Right, keep thinking pure thoughts, about the victory of Am Yisrael, how we're going to defeat our enemies, B'ezrat Hashem, and we'll defeat all of them, and we'll things are moving along very well. Baruch Hashem. Chazak Baruch.
Kavod Hav. Thank you so much.
See you tomorrow. All the best. Bye.